I'm Scott Klein. As Robert said, I work at ProPublica in New York. First thing, I just want to thank Tableau and Ellie and Robert for inviting me and giving me permission to show you pretty pictures of old data viz that hopefully you guys have not seen before. Who here, just by show of hands, who here is a journalist or sort of works in the kind of the first ring around journalism? All right, pretty good, pretty good. So ignore the man behind the curtain. There we go. I'm a pacer. They've given me a white line past which I'm not allowed to walk. So you're in charge of telling me if I walk past. You're in charge of telling me if I walk past. So this is me. I'm Scott Klein. As Robert says, I work at ProPublica in New York. My colleague CC Wei is here as well. We're a team that works in data journalism all the time. And being a history nerd, I started wondering how far back our history goes and was very surprised indeed about how far I could go. Who knows this guy? That's, who is he? It's Nate Silver, right. So a lot of people think Nate Silver invented data journalism in 2008. He had a terrible night last night. He called Michigan. He said 99% Hillary Clinton would win Michigan. She didn't. But he did not invent data journalism in 2008. I know I was doing it in 2008, and I'm sure he was not inventing it while I was doing it. Who knows this guy? Very few. Chad knows this. Chad, who is he? It's Phillip Meier, right. A lot of people think Phillip Meier invented data journalism. Phillip Meier was a reporter at the Detroit Free Press, or the Detroit News, actually, at the time. And he did a project about the 1967 Detroit riots, in which he used at the time, a supercomputer, an IBM 360, to analyze a statistical survey that they did of the rioters and won a Pulitzer Prize for it. But he did not invent data journalism either. It actually turns out that data journalism goes so far back, it actually predates newspapers themselves. These are the so-called bills of mortality. Early 17th century, London, a one-sheet document that told the people of London who died that week. It was published every week, cost a penny, much like a newspaper does. Let everybody know the christenings and the deaths in all of the different parishes in London. You can see it has very charming names for horrible diseases. There's dropsy, which is edema, and consumption, which is tuberculosis. 98 people died of tuberculosis in London this week. It's also, my favorite is Rising of the Lights, which is a funny name for a horrible thing. It's just it's a lung condition. So the lights were what they called lungs back then. But this was data journalism before newspapers were around, really, anything in like the form that we know them today. This was information, data that people needed to be able to live their lives and make good decisions. You can see you can see the rise of the plague if you look at all of these. You can see people can make good decisions about going outside or going into crowded areas if they know that there's a big epidemic going around. This is one of the oldest newspapers in the country, in the world, the Stanford Mercury. It's still being published today. And this is a 1714 issue of the paper that has not only on its front page but throughout data. So you can see that data was always a key part of how we did journalism. So here's the price of corn, which is grain. So the price, here's some commodities prices, wheat, rye, barley, different commodities prices. They're griping in the guts. There's a lot of dead bodies here too. There's a lot of death. There can be a lot of dead things in my slides. Also, goods imported at London, so a lot of shipping news, all the way since the beginning. Newspapers were involved in shipping news and other data, and reporting other data. This is Lloyd's List, also still published, which still publishes shipping news, and all the way back in 1740 was publishing the arrival of ships, commodities prices in faraway places and things like that. Who knows what this is? This is the first political cartoon. So this is in Benjamin Franklin's paper in 1754, the famous join or die snake, encouraging people, or maybe threatening people, I don't think history quite remembers, that they better join the American Revolution. But what people forget is that the paper also published lots of data. So again, this is America 1754. You can see here are all of the people who have arrived. Here are all the ships that have arrived, including a bunch of brigs. I don't know why. Hogshead staves, 4 pounds, 10 shillings, different commodities prices, different shipping news. So data was always a really key part. 1788, so before the Constitution was even ratified, we have our first election results graphic, at least the first that I could find. So this was in a Philadelphia paper showing the election for representatives to the federal government. This is Fred Muhlenberg. There's a college named after him, is who won. And you can see these are the first election results. Again, the first election results that I could find. This is a remarkable data display from a newspaper in the very earliest days about the ratification of the Bill of Rights. So here are the first 12 Bill of Rights. The first 2 were not ratified. So if a journalist ever tells you the reason the First Amendment, freedom of the press is the First Amendment is because it's so important, it's not true. It was the Third Amendment, but the first 2 were not ratified. And this is this beautiful, beautiful information display that includes the entirety of each article, of each bill in the Bill of Rights, which states had ratified it when, and then if you scroll down, they have a beautiful chart kind of explaining how the first 2 were not ratified. It was required that they be ratified unanimously. Absolutely something that I think any of us in a given situation would be proud to publish. I'm going to jump outside journalism for a second to talk about what was happening around the same time as that Bill of Rights graphic was being made. Who knows who made this? Playfair. This is William Playfair. Naomi, thank you very much. William Playfair is the person who invented most of the basic graphic forms we use every day today. He more or less popularized the line chart, but he invented the pie chart, and he invented the bar chart as we use them today. He lived around the turn of the 18th to the 19th century. He was an economist working in England. He published a lot. He published an Adam Smith book. He published a lot and really believed that his invention of graphical displays of statistical data was a much superior way to show this. A man who has carefully investigated a printed table finds when done that he has only a faint and partial idea of what he has read, and that, like a figure imprinted on sand, is soon totally erased and defaced. This mode unites proportion, progression, and quantity all under one simple impression of vision and consequently one active memory. So he was very much aware that he was inventing something and advocating its use more widely. Unfortunately, he was the only one who felt that. He died broke. This is not a picture of his grave. I cannot find where he is buried. He was a little bit of a con man, too, and did a bunch of things, unscrupulous things. But he died in 1823, and it was a long time before anybody started doing more graphics. Here was some of his press back in the day. No one will ever believe that such methods can serve any useful purpose in the study of statistics. Outside its use as a pedagogic means, it is like only a plaything without importance. This is a person talking about charts. Around then, newspapers started paying attention to this and started building their own. This is the oldest line chart that I can find in any news anywhere. This is from the Bombay Times in 1842, so not long after Playfair's death and a little bit before people were saying that Playfair's work would be forgotten. What's interesting to me about this, one of the reasons that it was so hard to publish things like this and why they were so rare is that the production of them was very difficult back in the middle of the 19th century. You can see this note. For the setting up of the above, meaning this chart, in movable types, we are indebted to Mr. Webster of the American Missionary Press, Bombay. So my guess, just kind of zooming into this and seeing how it's put together, you can see that this was probably put together as individual pieces of type that were created for this purpose. If you don't know, this is how newspapers were created and how printing was done pretty much until the end of the 19th century. Letter by people called compositors who worked in big rooms like this. And they had competitions where they would be able to move from the type case onto a composing stick as fast as possible to be able to make up the newspaper that night. So they had lots of tricks up their sleeve to be able to do information graphics. This is from the Napoleonic Wars, just to show kind of how recent or how sort of recent that war is. And it's sort of bizarre. You sort of think of the Napoleonic Wars as something that happened in the ancient past, but there was a newspaper that did a graphic about the Napoleonic Wars. This is the Battle of Trafalgar off of Cadiz, Spain. And in order to show how the battle would work, they built this graphic, again, using little types. So each one of these boats is a tiny little piece of metal type that they set in carved into a piece of wood and then printed it using letterpress printing. Later, they slightly advanced the technology using wood blocks. So this is from Harper's Magazine, something like Harper's Magazine. You can see that engravers had to use, I can't cross the white line, but engravers had to use wood blocks, separate wood blocks, to make up this giant image and then stitch them together. So you would have one artist who would draw the thing, and then there would be a team of engravers who would work nights and weekends, carving it into a piece of wood and then bolting them together, fixing any places where it didn't match. As journalists, as people working in newspapers, they would do this every night. Some of the things I'll show you are about news events that happened days before their quite complex graphics were published. So this is the kind of thing that they would have to do all the time and on deadline. So this was very difficult work. This is how they kind of bolted them together in the back. So even if you see a very large graphic, I'm going to show you a bunch of large graphics, know that they're made up of lots of little blocks of wood. Some of them were copper. Here's the New York Times from 1857. You can see little screw holes that accidentally got printed through. This is a graphic about the laying of one of the transatlantic cables. Around this time, there was a rise, especially in New York City, of the so-called penny press. These were newspapers that cost a penny. They were hawked by children in the streets called newsboys, way before their musical. And the penny press competed viciously with each other. What some of them used whenever they could were graphics, especially giant graphics on their front page, to try to compete with each other and sell papers. This is from the New York Daily Tribune from 1844. It's about the upcoming, I think it's the presidential election. And you can see this takes up virtually the entire front page of the paper. And it is remarkable. It's a really dense graphic. So it's a ward map of New York. You can sort of see that wards are giant because no one lived this far up back then. But the ward map of New York, it also included, if you lived in these wards, where you could vote, very good news you could use, who won the last mayoral election in each of these wards, and you can also see who won the last presidential election in each of these wards. So we were doing election graphics, pretty much since the beginning. 1844 is actually before the very first federal elections for president were held. It was back when states could vote from whenever they wanted. People know this one. Who knows this one? Chad knows this one. It's the Jon Snow Map, exactly. This is the Jon Snow. Jon Snow is a British doctor, probably the father of epidemiology. He essentially went door to door, asked people if anybody in their home had gotten cholera, checked a mark if they said they had, and he was able to show that the cholera was probably being caused by the so famous Broad Street pump. So the water was poisoning people in the area. It's a long story, lots of books written about it. But newspapers, people have forgotten, were doing similar things, trying to figure out what was going on with cholera. In 1849, there was a horrible cholera epidemic in New York City. It jumped the Atlantic on a ship, came here. And the New York Tribune, here's a clearer picture, and the New York Tribune published this beautiful old example of a line chart trying to show the percentages of deaths in the city that were due to cholera that summer. One of the most remarkable things about the many remarkable things here is this fantastic annotation that lets you know that they had no faith that people would understand how to read this chart. It says things like, each half inch along the bottom represents a week. The dates are placed under each. At the end of each half inch or week are upright dotted lines whose various lengths indicate the number of deaths by cholera and other causes during the week. If you think that there are innately well understood graphics or intuitive graphics, you may not be right. In 1849, this would have been like the most, for regular non-academics, the regular commuters in New York reading the paper, this would have seemed like an avant-garde piece of data visualization. This is the sort of Stephanie Posevec of its era. So they felt that they had to explain it. This, by the way, one of the reasons I think that they went to this incredible expense to make this, and again, you can tell that they did it quickly. The last data they have is from September 22nd. It was published on September 29th. So they really did this very quickly. This is the week that the editor of the paper, Horace Greeley's son, was actually killed by cholera. So the Civil War brought lots and lots and lots of mapping to New York papers and to Philadelphia papers. It was kind of a golden era of war mapping. You saw lots of papers competing with each other for the biggest and best battle maps. Almost every day of the war, a newspaper was publishing these. There started to be engraving companies that formed just to sell papers these graphics, and you can see these maps, and you can start seeing their names. You'll see some of their names here. Oh, it's not going to do me well. But even giant front page maps days after these battles. So, the Siege of Yorktown. One of these will say the date. Here we go. The G. Woolworth Colton, New York. So this is the engraving company that this newspaper hired to build this. And you would have correspondents telegraphing back general narrative descriptions of the battle scene. And you would have engravers, many of them working all at once overnight to try to be up fastest and best with the battle map that explained who won and how. So here's the Battle of Gettysburg, which was fought on Thursday, July 2nd. And this paper is on July 6th. So they did this in 4 days, and that's from the correspondent sitting somewhere here, standing somewhere in the field of battle, either telegraphing back or riding as fast back to New York as he could to describe the scene, to sketch the scene, and then to engrave it on those wood blocks as I was showing you. So this is sort of incredibly complex, incredibly beautiful graphics. I like this one. They were so popular that there was a political cartoon about them. Lamentable condition of an intelligent gentleman who lately devoted himself to the study of New York Herald maps. This is 1861 when things were going terrible for the North, so I suspect he was afraid. But you can really tell there's a bunch of Choropleth maps showing the progress of the war, and you can actually kind of watch the war happen if you can gather enough of these. You can see the South being strong and then starting to weaken and weaken. You can even see Sherman's march through Georgia, and it really tells the story. At the end of the war, there was a little bit more in terms of mapping. So this is a beautiful example of one of the transatlantic telegraph cables that was mapped. They even started doing, here's some depth maps. So there's even some more kind of sense of passing information as well as geography. But then things started to get a little bit more quiet. So jump ahead a few years. This is the very first isoline weather map, 1875 in the Times in Britain. This was done by Francis Galton, the statistics pioneer who figured out how to calculate isolines. And around this time in America, the U.S. Census started doing much more in-depth questioning of people and also much more beautiful information displays. So the census atlases of 1870, 80, and 90 are incredible works of art with not only incredible information design, but gorgeous, gorgeous maps. They're beautiful. And newspapers were also fascinated with the census around then and started doing some graphics of their own. This is a pie chart in the New York Herald trying to explain the population of different states using a donut chart, sort of, as well as, I guess, the population of other countries for reference. Lots of papers just copied it whole cloth. This was really before copyright was enforced in papers in different cities. So if you were a paper in Chicago, you could copy a paper in New York's graphic or story and vice versa, because how was somebody in New York going to know that this was already been printed in Chicago? So you saw a lot of copying back then. This is sort of one of the last gasps of the handset type version of graphics. This is a London paper's expose on the contents of our milk. And you can see how they tried to explain how in Westminster your milk was, I guess, mostly fine, but some of it was skimmed. It was like before they wanted skimmed milk. This was like a bad thing to call your milk. So one of the great technological innovations that changed how we were able to do graphics and news was the advent of the so-called photogravure process. It's the same thing that enabled newspapers to start publishing cartoons, which was a way to take a drawing, use a photographic process to directly transfer it onto a copper plate, and then to be able to print that copper plate. So you could make a more or less faithful reproduction of any drawing, good or bad. This is Winsor McCay, this is a good one, into the paper. And newspapers started using that for graphics pretty much right away. And you can see a marked change in what they looked like and how often they did them as soon as newspapers started buying these machines. So back to election graphics. This is 1888 in the New York Times, the beginning of, I think, a 4-page spread on the presidential election. A first sort of stab at very precise election results. Here's a little bit of a clearer one. I would not call this sort of super successful as a graphic. It doesn't feel any kind of less daunting than just the numbers. But you can see they were really trying to show every district in the country and who voted for what. But we got pretty good. This is a much easier to make, much more useful line chart. You started seeing lots more of those. I live in Brooklyn, so I like this one. It's sort of a political cartoon about all of the bosses that control Brooklyn. I live in, I think, either McGarry's Gold Mine or Shevlin City Seat, one of these. What I like about this, so it's sort of a cartoon, sort of splitting up Brooklyn into various corrupt bosses, but all of the roads lead to the poorhouse and the cemetery. So this is nicely done. Also the New York Times. Here's an early election Choropleth map. The great story about this. This is during the McKinley-Bryan election of 1896 that McKinley won. McKinley, most famous for dying in office. So this is the front page of the New York Times the morning after Election Day. And a friend of mine at the New York Times said, we find this remarkable. We sort of can't believe we can't do that today. How were they able to do that? The polls don't close until we already go to press. Well, the answer to that is that it's all wrong. So, in fact, here we are in Colorado, which they gave to McKinley, and in fact, Bryan won it. So a bunch of different states, it's just whatever the state the polls were in, they just kind of went. And I guess, they were, luckily, it wasn't like Dewey beats Truman. Luckily, McKinley did win, but they got a lot of states just wrong. Here's a beautiful, I show it just because it's beautiful, I think done in set type, an early cartogram. So this is, I think, an election, I don't know British history well, but I think an early election in Irish independence. So the dark squares are separatists and the white squares are unionists, but these are boroughs. These are, in theory, equivalent populations in each of these. So it's an early cartogram showing the support for Irish independence. Here's the various symbols. This is, again, I think built in type, but very quickly thereafter. It's beautiful. A quick digression. One of the things that I found most remarkable in my research is that before the radio, the way that people got their election news on the night of the election was to gather in large places and watch, usually where the newspaper headquarters were, and watch these information displays broadcast onto a wall or onto a sheet using slide projector, an early slide projector. So this is from Atlanta in the 1890s with a large group of people standing in the rain waiting to see the results of the McKinley-Bryan election. And these were huge events. They went back as far as I could look. This is before slide projectors, but here's a bonfire happening outside the New York Herald office for people. I think this is 1864, so this is one of the Abe Lincoln elections. People standing around the newspaper, and they would write. You can see a guy doing it. They would just write on blocks outside their, on plywood, I guess, outside their windows, what all of the different ward results were. So these were newspapers providing real-time information, much the same as they do now, just in a physical place and an excuse for a big party. They got pretty sophisticated. Here's that same McKinley-Bryan election. This would have been not in Times Square, but downtown in Park Row, where they would use very, very powerful projectors to project the results in front of huge, huge crowds. This is 1 million people in 1936 came to Times Square to look at the results of the election. It died more or less as radio became much more common. One of the other things that newspapers would do, so this is the New York Times headquarters, and one of the back when they were in Times Square for about a decade, and one of the things that newspapers would do is they would shine spotlights off the top of the building so that people in Brooklyn and in New Jersey could see who won the election just by looking at the horizon. And they became incredibly complex. So here's one, Hughes versus Hearst. So if Hughes won, they would flash the spotlight to the north, swinging east and west, doing this. And if Hearst won, they would do it to the south, going east and west. And the papers would also compete on this, and there were 4 or 5 papers simultaneously swinging spotlights on election night. And lots of cities were doing just this, and they became more and more complex, especially as they built taller and taller newspaper headquarters. But that's a brief digression. Back to photogravure. So photogravure could let us make graphics, even maybe not so good ones. We started really able to make them so quickly that we were trying a lot of stuff. Women's weapons, the Chicago Tribune. Chicago Tribune loved death and mayhem. It would have been a great paper to read. My favorite of the women's, first of all, books, but also potato mashers. Maybe they were sharper then? I don't really know. The Wilkes-Barre Times, sort of a classic example of what you probably don't want to do in making a bar chart, but charming nonetheless because we could do it. Just some more this is actually quite lovely. Remember back to the thing from the Napoleonic Wars where we were doing individual pieces of type. We could be much, much more sophisticated, start showing kind of isometric, views of the same kind of data. Around this time was the rise of eugenics and a lot of things we're not proud of. This is from the New York Tribune. When will the world be full? A question they answer, 2250, the world will be full. I don't think I will be around. But what I love about this, though, is they have a very early dot density diagram. Russia is very poor, sparsely populated. United States is pretty sparsely populated, but let's never get like Belgium. Again, another take at the same kind of data, getting a little bit closer on cholera and communicable diseases about the relationship between the weather and the disease. And it was still a few years off before we really understood this phenomenon, where we really kind of had good epidemiology and good science that could really stop these epidemics. But newspapers were helping get the word out about the relationship, again, between weather, how much people are outside, heat, and diseases. Here's another greatest hit. Bankruptcy threatens New York City if extravagances are not checked. And there's a bar chart listing the extravagances, chief of which is libraries. No more libraries. The Department of Correction, much less. Colleges, too. Libraries and colleges. Extravagances. The Wall Street Journal was actually pretty late to join this. I kind of thought that the Wall Street Journal would have, since the very beginning, been showing charts of commodities and charts of stocks and things like that. But they were pretty late. This was 1910. This was only 19 years before the stock market crashed. So they were not using graphics, but using a lot of tables, probably for the same reasons that our Playfair critics were saying these are not real science. So again, Chicago Tribune, a little bit obsessed with death. Here's apparently a guy who was reading the paper and fell out the window, which they explain in a very helpful graphic about how that might happen. I'm pretty sure this is his paper. You can sort of see he drops it. I like that. Lots of people apparently fell out of windows. You needed to understand how falling out a window works. So we have a lot of this. This guy killed himself. This guy was defenestrated. I just want to use that word in a sentence. This guy was actually thrown out. This girl survived. She sort of like rode down the window like a sail, and she's upset but alive. Another guy committed suicide. Crime was a big thing. We're going back in time now. Since during the handset type era, newspapers were publishing lurid crime stories and publishing with them floor plans of the murder scene. There are lots and lots of these. So you can see, if you read the story, you can see he was killed next to the bookcase, and here's the bookcase, and here's a little note, so you can kind of, while you're reading, you can kind of go back and refer to this graphic so you can understand it. They got much more sophisticated as time went on. We started drawing them. This one's about a guy who drowned in a water tank on a roof, and a graphic explaining how that works. Here are some mobsters who held up a hospital and took $3,500, and how they did it, and how they kind of kept everybody in the hallway and then escaped in a charming old car. Chicago Tribune did a lot of these. I love these old. They would draw on top of photographs and then publish that. So this was a mob era, 1920s mob hit in Chicago, a little explainer graphic explaining how the killer did the deed and then escaped. But also kind of supporting the populace around then. So this is coming toward the end of Prohibition. They did an information graphic in the Baltimore Sun explaining how deaths due to alcohol had actually risen not only up to pre-Prohibition levels, but well past. And this was one of the arguments to end Prohibition, that it was no longer had any efficacy in preventing the deaths that it had in the years following the creation of Prohibition. But if there's one takeaway from this, it's that we are, as journalists, as visual journalists, we are very much, we inherit our craft from the people who made graphics like this in 1896. We think about Playfair, and we think about Minar, and we think about these titans as our forebears, but they were largely academics working on long deadlines who had access to perfect information and could take the time they needed to do something. But really, it's the guy or the woman in the composing room or in the art department who drew this that we on deadline with imperfect data, without the polls all being closed, that we really inherit our craft from. And I do want people to know more about these. I mean, how much difference is there between this and that, right? John King inherits his awesome Choropleths that he shows on CNN every election night to those guys. Do people know what this is? This is from the early 1900s. This is a drive chart. So sports graphics you think of as a fairly modern thing, but they are old as well. So this is 116, 115 years old, explaining back when University of Chicago had a football team, how they played against Northwestern in a game. We do this exact same thing today. So we have color and we have better symbols, but we're still doing this work. This is a graphic that the Chicago Tribune made about the course of the National League in a year. And the New York Times kind of purloined that to do this tongue-in-cheek page about the collapse of the Chicago Cubs last season. You can see they published a little bit of an homage to that chart. This is the only nice thing that Edward Tufte said about journalism in his many books, was that he really liked this chart. So the New York Times just earlier this year not only remade it, but it made it with live data from around the country. So we really do inherit from, if we inherit from Minar and we inherit from Playfair, that's great, but we inherit from those people through the people who made graphics like this. And I just end my slides with this one because I really like it. But This is a Nigel Holmes graphic from Time. So that's what I got. I'm happy to take questions or show you any slides again. And I successfully stayed within the white lines.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So if anybody has questions, please raise your hands, and I'm going to come running to you and give you the microphone. Might just take a few minutes. We should get there.
Now somebody over there asked the next question. Right. All right, thanks, Scott. That was amazing. How do you research all this stuff? How do you find them?
So this is the result of a couple of years, maybe 3 or 4 years of looking. It is very hard. It's a needle in a haystack. We did not call things by standard names then, so I have searches that I've developed over the years in various newspaper archives, but we didn't call them information graphics, or we didn't really use words like we do now. So I have a search that works really well, above chart. The above chart shows, or the below diagram, so I search for those. One of my best, and the one that I found the New York Tribune graphic with, is diagram showing. So I use academic newspaper, digital newspaper archives, and things like that. But it's the difficulty is that we didn't have standard names for what they were called. I mean, there were a lot of people who called them statistical curves or statistical courses. But you kind of put that in and you get a lot of noise. And then sort of on page 13 of the search, there's one kind of really interesting thing.
Yes, you guys are creating and publishing applications now. And I'm curious about, I think that's something that's very interesting that the business community can actually learn from ProPublica. I'm curious how you guys sort of schedule, scale, budget an application that may cost this amount versus, and it will last this long, versus we could do 10 stories. How does that decision-making work?
Well, ProPublica is sort of a Galapagos island, so that calculus is a little different. So we can do one news application, which is just what we call our kind of large-scale interactive databases. It's not a handset app or something like that. But at ProPublica, we are trading off against stories for sure, but not a larger number of stories. So it would be, do you want to do a story, or do we want to do a database, or most of the time, do we want to do something that's sort of both a story and a database? So the trade-off isn't quite right. But at ProPublica, it really is about journalism and it's about impact, and we both believe in our mission and try our best to fulfill our mission, and also are funded because of how well we vindicate our mission. So we see the interactive databases as a core way that we fulfill our mission. We don't see it as trading off against some more kind of legitimate form of journalism or kind of narrative form of journalism, but we see it as kind of core. No, I'm not at all offended. So, but it's a very reporter-driven place. So if someone on my team, like Cece, whose title is developer, but she's a reporter as much as anything else, and if she's got a great idea and it's going to take a year, we do it. It depends. I'm actually doing a whole session about this at Nightcar if you're going. Dollars for Docs we've been doing since 2010, but Dollars for Docs is one of our most important applications. This is a project we did that lets you look up to see how much your doctor has taken in payments from pharmaceutical companies. And we've been doing that since 2010 every year. But that's a really important project for us. So we would that's something that we would keep up to date indefinitely. And now it's much easier because the federal government is actually publishing it. But we have other ones that we've been keeping up to date for a little bit less than that. It really depends on, is there an audience for it? Is there interest in it? Is it still important? Are we still planning to do more journalism around it? So it's sort of, again, it's mission goals. Does this still kind of fit within the mission? And also we have terrific developers who make it easier and easier for themselves every year. So keeping it up to date is not so hard.
this is sort of a selfish question since I work for the Associated Press, but in your research for the election graphics, was there evidence that the New York papers were using the AP telegraphic feed for that? And did we screw it up in 1896?
No. No, you screwed it up in 1918, the Wilson-Hughes race, which the AP called for Hughes, when Wilson had in fact won. And lots of papers, including the ones with spotlights, said that Hughes had won when he hadn't. But the AP's history of publishing election returns is old. It's into the 1840s and 50s in largely the same way they do it now. So I don't know if people who aren't journalists know this, but the Associated Press is stations tens of thousands, huge numbers of people in election districts around the country on election night, pays them, I don't know, in pizza or something, pays them like $50. $75 to sit and call election districts. Who won, what's your count? And they gather all of this, and they charge a decent amount of money for news organizations to be able to publish live election returns. So if you see live election returns on CNN, the New York Times, any big national paper, any big local paper, they are paying the Associated Press for that data. The Associated Press has a deserved monopoly on that data because they invest so much money in it. And they've been doing it in almost that form since the telegraph, since the 1850s. And the AP, by the way, has a whole archive. I have a sort of a time to go meet with the AP's archivist. It's really a remarkable history.
In your research, have you had the opportunity to take a look as well as, on the teams that did these visualizations before and how they compare to the teams doing visualizations and data stories today?
I've done a tremendous amount of digging to try to figure it out. I've looked at the archives of the New York, the papers of the people who ran the New York Tribune, the papers of the people who ran the New York Times. You see very, very little. There was no sense that the people in the composing room or the art department were, bylines were kind of a modern thing anyway, so they weren't really talking about who wrote what story a lot. But there was no discussion. I have no idea who made any of these. In the Tribune graphic of Cholera, they talk about a Professor Gillespie of Union College and how much in debt they are to him for the creation of this. So my sense is that some of these were people from the outside writing the editor and saying, hey, there's this thing called statistical curves or whatever they wanted to call it, or here are these charts. These help explain to people these phenomena. What if you guys made this, or I'll draw it for you. But beyond that, I have no idea. I wish I did.
So if William Playfair invented all these, or popularized these things, or he's known for popularizing them today, but you said that his contemporaries didn't really treat them with respect or use them, do you know if there's a line of descent from him to their newspapers, or were they independently reinvented and then only later did people go back and see his earlier work?
Absent a simultaneous invention, there would have to be. But the reason that so statisticians kind of crapped on it, but also there were a lot of meetings in the statistical societies that were around back then. And they were called statistical societies, but again, most of what you know about statistics, like correlation and regression, things like that, were 75 years after Playfair died. So it was like a different kind of sense of it, much more kind of arithmetic than statistics. But the statistical society spent decades trying to figure out at various proceedings and conventions what the rules around graphics would be. And it became, even the people who liked Playfair's stuff, it became this huge bureaucracy where they were like, what's allowed and what's not allowed and what's a good statistical chart and what isn't a good statistical chart. And that was sort of one of the things, like those people, Darwin needed to take care of those people for people like Minard to just start making stuff. So the French are really the people who started doing it really, really well in the 1860s and 70s.
My question has to do with the evidence of interpretability, because there's some papers that had very sophisticated charts, and then there seemed to be a lot of the cartoonish kind of graphics.
Yes, right.
And is there any evidence of types of newspapers based on their audience as to whether they went with the more charts versus the graphic drawings, and any evidence that people were understanding, because you were noting how they had all these explanations, any evidence that people were becoming more sophisticated in their ability to interpret this, so they didn't need the dotted lines of showing how gravity works and people falling, stuff like that.
It's a great question. So the evidence that I can muster, they don't talk about it in their papers. They don't talk about it in subsequent issues where they say, well, there's a little bit they say, we're making this again. Professor Gillespie helped us again, kind of thing. So we know that they kind of repeat the trick, which is a good sign that some things were working. But you can see the Chicago Tribune was really interested in murders and mayhem and mobsters, and so they published those cartoons a lot. Those kind of explanatory kind of information graphics a lot. But if you look at the cholera chart from 1849, there was nothing like that for virtually a decade after in the New York Tribune. So I think these things were very expensive. They must not have sold papers very well. You start seeing the New York Times start publishing very similar things. I'm talking about Professor Gillespie, so I suspect it was an editor changing hands and saying, I want to try this again. You certainly see less annotation. We obviously don't do it now, but you see less annotation than you needed to in 1849. In those annotations, there are lots of graphics that kind of explain how the graphic works, and you start seeing those disappear. So I think there's at least circumstantial evidence that the kind of cartoony stuff was popular because they started publishing them all the time. Certainly lots of evidence that people loved those maps because they were just ubiquitous for the 5 years of the Civil War. But then they were expensive, so I think they started publishing other kinds of things. But it's a great question.
So hello again. In response to that, I was going to ask you, Scott, if you're aware of Willard Brinton's book from 1914. Yes. So this is the first book on how to do data visualization. And in it, he talks a lot about, we should do bar charts, but the guys who can do cartoony stuff really well will be really successful. So he was talking 102 years ago about balancing engagement with effective charts. A lot of what Scott's been talking about today is relevant to that. Yeah.
Great, thanks.
Hey, Scott. Well, first of all, thanks a lot. Really fascinating collection of visualizations. So looking at this collection and the way you presented it, it looks like technology didn't allow us to change anything, right? It's like we are still using the same metaphors and all the rest. So what do you think is technology is enabling today that is having a substantial positive impact in journalism that was not possible in the past?
I mean, certainly interactivity. Certainly, not only things like D3, but just the fact that there are programmers who are interested in journalism who can make anything that's in their heads. And I think that, it would be it will be interesting to see. I mean, one thing that excites me by the giant explanations on these line charts that you think that any child should be able to read is that we can go past line charts. There are not 4 forms these are the only ones that work, and people won't get anything else because there's good evidence that people didn't get line charts, that we have to be taught anything. So I think that you can have avant-garde visualizations, that out there somewhere is a William Playfair who's going to make something that this room full of people will say is terrible and doesn't make any sense and should never be used, and people are never going to get it, but in fact are as kind of intuitive and will be as intuitive as line charts are to us now. So, the technology is here to enable all sorts of crazy stuff that none of us can imagine that will be the line charts and bar charts of the future.
We saw a lot of simple tables in the beginning of the presentation, and I just wonder, where would you draw the line between just mentioning 1 or 2 numbers in an article and actual data journalism?
Well, I mean, these were not 1 or 2 numbers. I mean, this was from the early 1600s, and they did this all around the world. I have hard enough time finding these in English. I don't know how to say, statistical curves in every language, or even if that's what they called them then. But they were doing really good mortality statistics and publishing them for a general public. And this was not 1 or 2 numbers. These were pretty sophisticated. And this was, the rest were largely for a business audience, so you sort of needed to know what ships were coming in and what was on them and things like that. But this was hard stuff, and they were doing it on deadline. So even if it's one or two simple numbers, they were going from, the dock to the urchin selling papers in hours.
You have a few more minutes for questions, and I should also say that people on the live stream, we are trying to figure out how to get on the internet again, because the Wi-Fi in here is as dead as a ghost. And but once we do that, we're going to actually take some questions from Twitter as well.
I was fascinated by your 1849 example of the Tribune showing essentially correlation lines, I guess. In your research, can you identify a time when the narrative has gotten better? Because it had a fascinating narrative under that chart, quite colorful on how it explained it. But is there a time, are we getting better at the narrative, the story behind the chart, I guess?
I don't know if we're getting better. It is a tremendous amount of fun reading newspapers from back then. They are muscular, and the prose is florid in a way that we would never write now. And it sort of takes a delight in the news in a way that we are very flat now. So I don't know if we've actually gotten better narratively. We've certainly become more dispassionate. We've become more unbiased, I guess, more objective, to use a bad word. They definitely took sides. So if you read the New York Tribune from 1849, it was a abolitionist Republican paper that in every word and deed kind of vindicated those motives. But the writing was way better then. It's a tremendous amount of fun. There's the very first example of election coverage in the New York Times where they had ward reports from every single ward from the election that year, 1852-ish. And they sort of take delight in finding fights and take delight in finding election fraud. And kind of, the longest, most beautiful passages are, where there were kind of thugs beating up people who were trying to vote. I mean, it really is a remarkable era in journalism. But there's a great book called Discovering the News, and I'm blanking on the Schudson, which explains all of this better than I ever could, kind of about the rise of objectivity in news and the audience's need for objectivity, that we sort of changed the culture. We started developing things like commuters. We didn't have commuters. We had people kind of doing sustenance farming or working kind of in the factory that was a block from their house. But we started having people who had time in a commute. They weren't riding their own horses to work, but sitting in a bus. And how did the newspaper change when that happened? So you can kind of see the information needs of the populace change as the Industrial Revolution takes off. And Schudson talks about that in his book too.
In terms of enabling your reporting or your organization's reporting and doing more public good, are you spending more time in going through and organizing and researching data sets that already exist but maybe aren't really, the insights aren't really accessible? Or are you spending more time actually curating and developing new data sets, maybe at a different level?
I would say the majority of our data sets are from the government, but they're not necessarily ones that are on data.gov, right? They're not necessarily ones that are part of an open government initiative and already out there. The things, because we're investigative journalists, that we're most interested in is a data set that we know exists because a source has told us or because of other reporting that we've done, and that we FOIA that or we kind of get a source to give it to us and things like that. So Dollars for Docs, which I was talking about before, is a data set where we actually created the data set. So that was from website scraping and getting it through sources and things like that. That was not a data set we kind of got from an agency. That was one that we made. That is much more rare.
Hey, Scott, I have a question. One thing that strikes me as I was watching your presentation is back then it was definitely, one to many, right? I mean, I either have a way to make newspapers or I don't. Now you've got people out there doing all kinds of things, right? Citizen journalists, people just interested in a topic, academics whose research is more accessible. At ProPublica, how much does the kind of swirling conversation influence your work? Is it something you kind of try and tune out so you can go and do something different, or is it something you draw on?
With the conversation about
anything that you work on, any project, there's a bunch of people talking about it, maybe some people doing different work on it. How much of that do you all kind of dip into and take advantage of, or try to stay away from?
I mean, we think about it a lot, and we look at it a lot. I mean, ProPublica is a mission-driven organization. We don't want to just publish things. We want to have impact in the real world. We want to make journalism that makes the world a better place. And so part of that requires that you pay attention to the conversations around your stories. You're sort of now kind of required to, in a way that if you were publishing in a traditional newspaper, maybe you didn't need to worry so much about it. You always needed to make sure nobody was saying like a criticism that you needed to take into consideration, maybe a correction or something. But that conversation is really important to us. We have a team of engagement people who are forever paying attention to the conversation on social media. Reporters who have lots and lots of time and are usually working on stories for years and following up on it for years these are their sources. So if there's an academic paper that comes out, or if an academic, or if someone talks about the results of our story and builds on it, we get really excited, and we typically those people are already in our orbit. But we want, Dollars for Docs. There were 200 newspapers that did stories based on our Dollars for Docs data, and that's exactly what we want.
One last quick question.
Hi. So I notice a lot when we talk about older charts and graphs, especially when they're included in journalism, we mostly see bar charts and line graphs, and I was curious if you came across any like old school network analysis graphs in those older prints, and sort of when we started to see those pop up with the bar charts and line charts.
I did not see any social network graphs. Those feel, I bet Robert knows when those were invented.
No.
No, those feel like 1990s. I feel like I remember before social network graphs. I think those seem pretty early. I definitely found things that I found like a kind of proto tree map. I found some old things, not in news, but in a census atlas. But the census atlases is where you would find it, right? The census atlas is where you find them doing weird stuff, because their audience was demographers. They kind of people who would have been familiar with graphical displays of data anyway. So the census atlases, I think all or most of which are online, you can just start thumbing through them, is where you'll find the kind of the weird and woolly stuff. But I saw no social networks in the past.
Great, thank you so much. That
Thanks,
brings us
everybody.
to the end of this session. Thank you, Scott.